Look in your cabin.
It's the back there.
He doesn't like you when I take pictures.
I'm getting me because you travel. Just go to state. Is she good?
I don't know. He doesn't like it when I take pictures.
I probably have gotten this shirt off. Oh my God. Can you sit down? Where does she go now?
All right, let's get started. Good afternoon. Welcome back. I hope that you had a good weekend or enjoying the better weather. We are now at the midway point. Week 5 is about halfway through the term, so we're speeding right along. So this week, we have a new round of theories to talk about. We also have a new set of presentations up this week. So we'll spend some time talking about the first of 3 theories. I've also graded, you should receive your scores on the annotated bibliography assignment. So I want to take some time today to debrief and talk about that assignment, some of the things that I noticed, and some feedback that I have for you that will hopefully help as you're gearing up to write the first application paper. So we'll talk about that in just a little bit. So going into this week, we have Jade, who will be doing a presentation on communication privacy management. We'll hear from JT and Isaac both on Wednesday. We'll be doing separate presentations related to groupthink. And then Kendra on Friday on organizational culture theory. One thing I want to direct your attention to is that while we have new theories this week, these are not candidates for your first application paper. Any of the theories from here on are options for your second paper, right? I wanted to have options for the first application paper discussed earlier, so you had more time to think about how to use them. But ones this week and on can be used in your second paper for the course, which is just like your first, but it would do a later theory in class, and then you'll get to choose one for a revision. So last class, we heard from Angela, who talked to us about face negotiation theory, showed us the fun Finding Nemo example. We talked about how this theory is the way that we manage our reputation, our public persona, and the way that we present ourselves to other people, particularly thinking about this in the context of other cultures and how reputation can be a really important thing. And the ways in which reputation is in many ways impacted by individualism versus collectivism. So for today, we'll hear from Jade here in just a second. Debrief the annotated bibliography, some of the things that I noticed, feedback for you. And then we'll be talking about communication privacy management theory. So getting us started, let's go ahead and hear from Jade. Jade, I have your presentation up, so we should be all set.
And then you also have my outline.
Yes, yes, got that right there. You're welcome to click or use arrows to move between. Okay.
Okay, so my theory today is communication privacy management. This theory focuses on how people make decisions about revealing and concealing private information. It's mostly evidence-based, and it the way people reveal and conceal private information is perceived on benefits and costs of disclosing that information. Sandra P right here, she's the one who came up with this theory. It was in 1991 that she decided she wanted to write about this theory, and she is a professor at the University of Indiana. So there's a few key concepts about this theory, and those include privacy ownership, privacy control, and privacy turbulence. So privacy ownership refers to how people feel about their private information and like having control over their, well, not control because privacy control, but owning their private information. Privacy control refers to how the original owner of that information decides where and when they reveal or conceal that information. So like if you're at the doctor's office, and you know your your stuff is going to be safe with your doctor because of HIPAA. So you'll reveal that, or if you're on a first date and you don't really want to tell someone, you know, like something super personal, then you'll decide to conceal it. Privacy turbulence refers to when the rules of the boundary coordination are unclear, or when people's expectations for privacy management come into conflict with each other. So basically, you know, if something goes wrong in that date and you do tell them something and they tell another person, it's kind of like that. So traditions and context and conclusions of this theory. It's a socio-cultural tradition, and it is in the context of interpersonal. So it's just typically between two people. It can also be through media, but not in the sense of like context. It uses the term dialectic inaccurately. So like some of the problems with this theory, and claiming that in nature it is in nature when it really is based on dualistic thinking. And then relevance to the outside world. As you can probably like tell, it has to do with a lot of like family communication. So that's like focused on secrets and topics that you want to avoid with your family. So like if you wanted to come out to your family, but you're afraid that maybe they wouldn't accept you, then that would be something you choose to disclose or not disclose. Media, so that is, when talking about media, it's mainly focused on social media. And it is whether, you know, you're gonna post something that someone told you about themselves, or if you wanna post something about yourself that you think is gonna stay in that area. And then, like I mentioned earlier, in the healthcare system with HIPAA and patient doctor confidentiality. Other relevance to the outside world includes relationship issues, work-related complications, and intercultural communication. The one that I found really interesting actually is intercultural communication, because of, you know, like if you're in a different country, some people might choose to tell things versus whether you're in the United States and we keep things private versus what other people keep private. And with that, I conclude my presentation.
All right, thank you so much for getting us started today, Jade. I really like, particularly toward the end, the way that you were incorporating these examples and applications, right? There are a lot of, not just our interpersonal interactions with other people, but also in organizational settings and in more professional contexts, ways that we try to negotiate privacy. I like the way you bring up sort of doctor-patient confidentiality, HIPAA protections, and so on, right? In healthcare, we're oftentimes having to make decisions about what information we choose to disclose and share with professionals, how we're making those determinations. Also, the way that you were talking about culture, right, and what might be acceptable for one culture to disclose and share might be considered private or inappropriate in another culture, including discussion about mental health, stigma, illness, and so on. So really good job in getting us starting to think about and engage with this theory as a good starting point for us to think about some of the details of communication privacy management. This theory is kind of an interesting one in the term because this theory goes back to a lot of interpersonal communication, right? So we've been talking about media a little bit. We'll be looking back at interpersonal communication, and then the other two theories this week are going to be focused more on organizational communication, right? Organizational communication being how structures and groups communicate and form identity and culture. So we're focusing more on interpersonal for now. So before we get into that, I wanted to take some time to talk about the annotated bibliography, some of the things that I noticed, how I went about grading this assignment and things that I think will help you as you get thinking about designing your application paper. So you'll notice that your score is out of 100, right? That is 10% of your grade. Also, your grade, you're individually graded in each of those sections of the rubric that correspond to the different guidelines there. So I wanted to talk about some of the things that went well. I really thought that overall there was good use of pretty clear conventions and structure. One thing that I really appreciated was that people definitely understood and were able to engage with outside scholarly articles. I did not run into any issues where I was thinking, is this an article that would be appropriate or credible for this assignment? The article selection was really good, and I appreciate you all bringing that in and offering some observations here that I think connected pretty well to the theory that you chose. So I thought that that went pretty well. One kind of minor note regarding citations when you're doing something like APA or MLA, make sure, especially when you're copy pasting, that you are keeping any italicization that is included, particularly if you're citing like the title of a journal, you would italicize that, right? And typically you would italicize the volume, followed by issue in parentheses without italics. So make sure that you're including italics when you're citing the name of a journal or a book. There were a few entries that didn't include that, so just a minor thing to pay attention to. One thing that I noticed, right, is in the annotations, just make sure that you're clearly explaining, for instance, in your application paper, how your theory or idea is linking. There were some situations in the annotations where there was a very extensive description of the project or of what that article was offering or talking about, but it wasn't clear how that was linking directly into your theory. So just make sure that you're including that voice and perspective there. And sort of thinking about what I noticed here, in addition to those minor convention things, including working on the full citation, including italics, make sure to just keep your own voice for this project, right? I will tell you that application papers that have gone really well have been ones which people are explaining the theory and explaining, you know, the artifact or piece of media, but they're only giving enough information for people to understand before diving into analysis, right? If you spend the entire paper explaining what the show is that you're analyzing or providing like a synopsis of the show, or you spend the entire paper like describing the theory, that's missing the focus of the assignment. Spend a bit of time talking about the theory and the artifact, enough to get us going, and then spend the bulk of the paper really analyzing and showing us how those two things connect together, right? Talking about an episode of a show is great. Try to reduce it down to a paragraph, and then after that say, we see this theory in action because, or this is an example of symbolic interaction theory because. That type of active language will help a lot to just make sure that you're analytic and you're focused on the paper. So try to keep your descriptions of the theory and of the artifact generally to the introduction or first couple paragraphs. So what I want you to take some time to do on your own for your attendance credit for today is a little bit of a chance to brainstorm and start to think about the next planning stage for your first application paper. This application paper, again, is due on May 8th, so it's due 2 weeks from today. So I really want you to start to think about and plan how to move forward on this one. If you were here on Friday, we took some time for you to brainstorm some possible ideas and share them with somebody else in the class. And if you were not here last Friday, then I'd just like you to think about some possible communication artifacts that you could analyze for this assignment, and then possible theories that you could use for your analysis. If you were here on Friday, do you feel any more strongly toward any of your ideas? Maybe you've let an idea or two develop, or maybe in talking to somebody else on Friday, you felt like you have a clear direction as to where to go. Or if you've developed any new ideas over the weekend, or just thinking about it now, you're welcome to jot down those additional ideas as well. So what's kind of changed between now and Friday? What has developed? so on. Once you've done that, take a theory that you might want to use in that application paper. And I want you to think about a couple relevant concepts that might be applied in your paper, right? We've talked about the idea that concepts are the building blocks of your theory, right? So it's not just enough to say that there is, you know, for instance, face negotiation theory. There are also concepts such as positive face and negative face that are used to build this theory. And then the last thing I want you to do is to develop a little bit of a timeline for yourself, right? Be thinking about, maybe work backwards from the deadline to think about what you plan to do by what date. For instance, maybe by Friday, you finalize your topic. Maybe by next Monday, you produce an outline, so on. Like before, I'm happy to look at rough drafts or outlines. If you send them to me in advance. I would just recommend that you get that draft or outline to be no later than not this coming Friday, but next Friday. You might consider that as part of your time. Give you about 5 or 6 minutes to work on this.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So for the first part, with our current ideas, do you mean the way we're applying an actual situation to the theory we're going to be using?
So on Friday, I asked you to maybe think about and brainstorm some ideas, right? I'm asking you to think about an artifact, right? A piece of communication and a theory that you'd be using to analyze that piece of communication. It's kind of like the examples we've been talking about in class. go ahead and wrap up. In order to help and hopefully make the process of completing this paper a little bit easier, I also wanted to show you, and I'll be uploading to Canvas, an example paper that I think does a good job of showing this in action. This is a previous student paper that did really well. So this is a TV show analysis of an episode of The Big Bang Theory. And as an example of using social penetration theory. So the paper goes through social penetration theory and explains how the two characters depicted on the show are using this theory in action. So rather than providing an overly long explanation of the show, right, the theory and fundamental elements are established here in the opening paragraph. Early on, right, the essay is using some of the ideas about this theory, including the orientation stage, social penetration theory, using a quotation from the show to kind of show these interactions happening. As you can see, superficial and frivolous details are showing the orientation stage. Moving on to the affective stage, more casual communication between the two, right? Continuing into the more deeper stage, also some examples of deep penetration and transgression, right? So I wanted to highlight this example because I think it does a good job here of incorporating, right, the references from the TV show, but also utilizing the source from the textbook, including direct quotations, interactions among characters. If you're doing something like a public speech or an advertisement, right, it could be examples from that piece of communication. And it's using specific concepts within social penetration theory to explain what's happening in the show, right? So I think this is a good example of what I'm looking for here because you're using those relevant elements of the theory to show us and paint a picture of what's happening there. So I'll post that example paper after class, but again, I wanted to share it because I think it helps as you're working through to know what to expect. Before we get into some of the things about this theory today, any questions related to the application paper, the annotated bibliography, or anything else about the class at this stage? Awesome. All right, so I thought Jay did a great job getting us started in thinking about communication privacy management theory. This is a theory that feels pretty closely related to some of the other theories that we've talked about, including uncertainty reduction theory and social penetration theory. Again, it's looking primarily at communication between two people and about how they share information that they might not be comfortable with sharing with everybody, right? This idea here is that it assumes at kind of basic level that we have private information, right? We have details about ourselves that we're not necessarily comfortable sharing in front of large groups of people, right? For instance, your social security number is probably very private information and something that you wouldn't even necessarily share with a family member or close friend, right? The idea that we have this information is the starting point. And because we have this information, we're making decisions about who we choose to share it to, and ultimately, at what stage in relationships we are comfortable sharing that information, right? Giving it kind of like a game metaphor, right? Has the relationship flag been checked in order to provide that information to somebody else, right? People create rules on who and how they share and disclose information. And also, there are what are known as core and catalyst situations that might cause our standards and expectations to disclose information to change. And there's also this idea of privacy turbulence that we'll get to. That refers to situations in which there's a mismatch between the privacy we're comfortable sharing and what other people actually know about us. So again, interpersonal, interpretive, and positivistic in its approach. It's been used in both ways. So I think one of the easiest examples of communication privacy management theory in action has been just about any kind of superhero comic or show or film in which a character has a secret identity, right? The idea is that a lot of the drama and tension in these media is developed because the characters are really cautious about how and why they choose to disclose their secret identity and to whom, right? For instance, the character Spider-Man is famous for having the secret identity and making sure that nobody outside of very close relationships knows that he's Peter Parker, right? So I'll highlight in a minute an example from Spider-Man Homecoming of that in action, although the following two movies after that definitely show some of the elements privacy and disclosure too, right? Without getting into spoilers, people who haven't seen these films, the question of who knows Spider-Man's identity has always been a major source of drama. So this theory is important to us. Why should we care? It's for a few reasons. First of all, it's useful to understand and engage with boundaries, right? The idea being that creating appropriate boundaries with other people, knowing what private information we do and don't share is really important. It also helps us to understand why and how we disclose private information. If we've made like a fast friend and close relationship with somebody like a roommate, somebody that we get along with well, what makes us comfortable around other people is something that we come to develop. And this is a more recent theory, right? It came out more in the 90s, which compared to a lot of the theories that have been around for, in some cases, millennia, going back to rhetoric, and in a lot of cases, centuries, it's good to have a more contemporary approach. So use the same image, but Dr. Pedrino is at Indiana, and again, is focused on understanding human relationships. So communication privacy management, CPM, is bringing with it a few different assumptions. We make choices, which is pretty straightforward, right? Including choices about who and how we choose to disclose information. We make and we follow rules, right? The idea being that we make rules about who we choose to communicate with about what. For instance, maybe you've decided that, you know, when you talk to a grandparent, you are not going to disclose and share your opinions about politics, right? That might be an example of creating boundaries. And that our choices and the rules that we make are based on how we feel about ourselves and what we're comfortable sharing, and also what we come to know and understand about other people, right? As we kind of figure out the terrain, stranger danger, figuring out if somebody is trustworthy or not, that is a big factor in how we choose to disclose information. So CPM had kind of an interesting start, right? A lot of theories from the course kind of start in a very specific situation, but snowball and become a lot broader. So I think this theory is kind of interesting because it actually started in examining like intimate couples, and particularly how couples would choose to disclose and share information related to cheating, right? In a monogamous relationship, if one person cheated, how might somebody choose to disclose and share that that happened? What are the motivating factors surrounding that disclosure? How is that private information revealed in the context of that relationship? So that's kind of where things got started, is disclosure related to married couples or people that were very involved in that capacity. But this theory has in many ways branched out and become a lot more general in its approach in a way that it analyzes our human relationships with each other, right? So it has a lot of different applications, and as Jade mentioned, can even be used in more applied contexts such as health and culture. So there's some important ideas to know here in thinking about this theory. One is this idea of private information. Again, that's your social security number, That's you know, basic personal information about your life you might not want to share with the average person, right? And that it matters to you, and you make decisions on what of that information you disclose. Private disclosures, then, are you choosing to share that private information with other people? It's telling a close friend, hey, I'm Spider-Man, right? It's choosing to give that information out to other people. Private boundaries are the kind of dividing lines similar to social penetration theory. Thinking back to the onion, right? What is dividing out information that's available to a large group of people? Something that might show up on a social media page or on your LinkedIn versus information that is only accessible to people that you truly know and understand. In fact, if you follow or are seeing posts by people on social media and you notice that suddenly they've gone offline or suddenly they have this job change or there's a relationship status change, but you don't know what's going on or you don't know the details about that, right? That's a distinction between public and private. And then privacy turbulence, you can think about as like on an airplane, if you're experiencing turbulence, right? It's a very discombobulating feeling. It oftentimes makes you reach out for your drink or just make sure that you're stable and where you're sitting or located, right? And then in the same way, we feel discomfort, we feel turbulence, right? And feel kind of shook if there's situations in which private information is shared in a way that we don't like. A really good example of this is if somehow private information about you became public, like you have a parent who chooses to tell a really embarrassing story from your childhood when you're with a friend, right? Or gets out the baby photos when you are bringing somebody home, right? Privacy turbulence might also be related to information that might get leaked or shared online, right? One area of a lot of discussion and controversy has been about the leaking of classified intelligence information. For instance, if you're familiar with WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, and similar figures who have leaked private information, that has also, of course, brought about significant turbulence in the realm of foreign policy. There are what are known as both core and catalyst situations, right? And core and catalyst are some of the ways that we make decisions about the disclosure and sharing of information. What this theory argues is that we actually have a set of standards, whether or not we've written them down or just kind of follow them as a bit of a rule of how we choose to disclose and share information. One example, right, is the norm of people saying, I'm not going to talk about my exes on a first date, right? And that is a core criteria because it's something that would stay relatively stable, right? Whereas a catalyst, right, if you think about a catalyst, like in chemistry, the catalyst is the thing that suddenly causes the change. It's what puts you over the edge, right? It's a circumstance or issue and event that can come out and motivate or cause sharing to happen. Whether it's voluntary and suddenly something has changed, you feel comfortable sharing that, or due to circumstances outside of your control, you're now forced to share private information that you didn't intend to. For instance, you know, Spider-Man's mask comes off and gets kind of torn apart, and suddenly everybody who's there sees that it's Peter Parker, right? It's an example of a catalyst situation because it wasn't really his control, but now he has to disclose that information. Or maybe you're talking to a friend and that friend suddenly discloses a personal story surrounding their challenges related to mental health. And in response, out of solidarity and support, you choose to share your experiences related to mental health as well. That would be a catalyst that changes and goes outside what you might normally have as boundaries for self-disclosure. So, like some of the previous theories that we've been talking about in class, this theory is what is known as axiomatic, right? It has axioms or rules that assume how we communicate and behave. particularly surrounding privacy, how we manage privacy, and how we choose to communicate with other people. So I'll be going over those axioms in a little bit more detail. And you could think about incorporating a couple of those if you wanted to do that for your second application. The first axiom, right, is pretty basic. The idea that we believe that we hold private information about ourselves and other people that are close to us, right? It's kind of like having keys to an apartment or a house or a door, right? Those are yours. You might choose to duplicate and give your keys to a friend, right? But ultimately, you're the one with the keys, and it's your choice as to how you're going to distribute and use your keys. The second axiom is this idea of becoming an authorized co-owner, right? In other words, when you are sharing private, personal, detailed information with other people and trusting them with that information, right? That means that that person who now has that information is responsible for it in their own way, right? If you've seen the Spider-Man films, he has a best friend named Ned, right, who discovers the secret. And Ned likes to joke that he wants to be like the man in the chair that's, you know, telling him the strategic decisions, telling him where to go and what to do, right? Ned, Spider-Man's friend, is an authorized co-owner who understands and supports the private information that Peter Parker has. The third axiom deals with the idea that even if somebody is disclosing private information to somebody else, right, that original owner is still somebody that owns the rights to that information. One way of thinking about this is don't tell anyone I told you this, right? Oftentimes, if you're disclosing and sharing a secret or something very personal to you with a friend, you would feel upset if gossip and sharing that information got spread to a larger group of people, right? The idea that that friend or person did not respect your needs, your boundaries, and was not considerate of that private information causes you to have that specific reaction, right? If Ned went around telling everybody that Peter Parker was Spider-Man, then there would be a serious breach of trust, right? The idea that if somebody does not have the ability to keep a secret or keep things in confidence, that can be a big issue. Number 4 is this idea that an original owner is able to develop privacy rules that impact how information is shared and circulated with other people. Again, using core and catalyst criteria that we talked about, the standards by which people choose to disclose and share private information, we get to see that in action. So if you're an original owner, right, you are deciding who gets that information, how they get that information, how close or connected you have to be to that person, or what that person's relationship to you has to look like. For example, right, if you got a new job, but you don't want to tell your current boss that you got a new job, you might choose to wait and tell your friends that it stays between all of you. So, getting on to number 5. For an original owner, right, if you own the keys and you've given the keys to somebody else, to continue to control the information after you shared it with somebody like a friend or family member, you have to create rules with that other person about whether or not they can tell anybody else, who they can and can't tell, how that information is getting used, right? Again, using lines such as, don't tell anybody I told you, this stays between you and me, somebody asking how many people know in order to make sure that information doesn't get outside of what's acceptable is a way that the original owner really tries to make control of that information. Like if you are duplicating your keys to give it to a friend because your friend needs a place to stay and they can stay in your dorm while you're away, right? Maybe that's agreed upon. But if your friend brings on some other friends and they come into the dorm too, you might feel like that went against the agreement and the trust that you've created with other people. Again, a really big idea in this theory is the idea that the original owner does whatever they can to maintain control of their private information, right? And then number 6 is the idea that co-owned information leads to privacy boundaries. That is, the co-owners are now in it. They're on the inside. And therefore, they are also responsible for keeping information that should be kept private. In this way, the way in which private information is shared and used is something that all members of the group now have a stake in, right? Ned, now that he knows that Peter Parker is Spider-Man, also has to be cautious of how he communicates and shares information, knowing that this secret exists, right? It'd be hard to do so if you're not good at keeping a secret, because you're now responsible for that private information. Number 7, the collective privacy boundaries. Now that you have multiple people who know your secret and know personal information, then you all agree about how that private information is shared, used, and circulated, right? The idea here being that in a very similar way to one person making a decision about privacy, that group of people are also having to make decisions about that. And then lastly, the final axiom here is this idea that things go wrong, right? Sometimes there are minor issues. For instance, somebody saying, hey, they weren't supposed to know that you were pregnant yet. You weren't supposed to share that yet. We're going to wait another week, right? To incredibly personal details and information about other people. For example, the idea of being doxxed, right? Where people will post online like your address, location, and super personal details that's designed to be like an incredible breach of privacy and cause for concern are examples of breaches in communication. You might be familiar with the semiotic author Roland Barthes, who is famous for putting forth this idea, death of the author, birth of the reader. The idea that when media and communication is circulated, that in a way, once you put that media out there, you're no longer an owner of it, right? It becomes part of the public consciousness. That you could create a movie and maybe you have a specific intention and plan, but it's out of your hands at that point, right? Public gets to interpret and make sense of that. In the same way, we choose to disclose a secret for a friend, but we really try to maintain some level of control and influence. We don't like the idea that it's totally in the friend's control to do whatever they want. So this is a new theory. As Jay brought up, right, this question of dialectic versus duality is important. Dialectic, going back to the Greeks, being this idea of discovering the truth through communication between two people, really engaging, which is not necessarily what's at play, right? This is more about relationship between two people and different communication dynamics. So there's some critique of the language used in this theory. And this theory is still potentially a little bit narrow, right? This theory does have limitations in terms of private information being disclosed and used. So I want to share a short clip from Spider-Man Homecoming that I think does a good job of showing communication privacy management in action and helping us to think about a lot of these elements of how we choose to make disclosure decisions with other people. So I'll go ahead and share that clip with you. And as you're watching, think about the elements of this theory, the axioms that we've talked about might be relevant here.
Nothing.
Yeah, this Spider-Man from YouTube.
I'm not.
You were on the ceiling.
No, I wasn't. Nick, what are you doing in my room?
Me, and you said, what up, there's a Death Star.
You can't just bust in our room.
That turkey meatloaf recipe is a disaster. Let's go to dinner. Ty, yeah, want Ty?
Yeah.
No, he's got a thing.
A thing to do after.
Okay. Anybody else wants?
Oh, she doesn't know.
Nobody knows. My name is Stark knows he's in my suit, but that's it.
Tony Stark. Are you an Avenger?
Basically. This gotta keep it a secret.
A secret why?
You know what she's saying? She finds out people trying to kill me every single night. She's not letting me do this anymore. Come on, man, please.
Okay. I'll level with you. I don't think this is a secret. It's the first thing that's ever happened with Peter.
May cannot know. I cannot do that to her right now. You know, when everything is happening with her, please.
Okay,
Just swear, okay?
I swear.
Thank you.
You really stop right now. Can I try the suit on?
No,
How does it work? Is it magnets? How do you feel the strings?
I'm gonna tell you about this tomorrow, okay?
So kind of a fun example, right? But I think we see a lot of different parts of the Syrian action here. First of all, there is a Catalyst situation, right? He's crawling back into his room and he doesn't remember that his friend is there. And then suddenly, you know, he's forced to have to disclose and share, which is not his choice. So suddenly he's had to readjust and be like, okay, I've got to tell you, I've got to explain all of this because there's no going back. Also, right, Ned thinks this is so cool and exciting. He wants to tell everybody about it. And so Peter has to create this agreement and say, no, this is private. And one thing that I find really interesting too, right, is that he really makes the point that Aunt May can't know, right, because of the fear that if she does, that she's in danger. And so he has to negotiate that with Ned to make sure that they're in agreement, that it's not disclosed with her, right? And then using that agreement, they're now co-owners of that private information, where they're trying to work together and use that information. So in a very kind of instantaneous, immediate reaction, Peter has already created a lot of the standards of communication privacy management that we've been talking about for today. So a lot of different ways we can see this in superhero films, but also useful ways to think about our own disclosure of personal information that we might choose to give to other people. So to wrap up for today, we spent some time talking about and helping you prepare for the first application paper. If you have any additional questions related to your annotated bibliography, I'm happy to talk about your grade and all of that stuff in a little bit more detail. Talked about CPM, and we heard from Jade in discussing private information, this idea that we become these co-owners who are working together. So next class, we'll be talking about groupthink. We'll be moving on to organizational theories, understanding the problems that happen in larger groups, and seeing some ways that that plays out in things like television commercials. So please email or pass forward your attendance activity for today. Have a great rest of your Monday, and I look forward to seeing you all again for Wednesday's class.